It happens because we started with process, and we said that we will not sacrifice anything we will not sacrifice one iota of guest comfort for any of these sustainable ideas.
Wow.
But it turns out that it is a sustainable idea to cause us to feel better in an indoor environment. So we put in more outside air than most any other public spaces into the space, which is a difficult thing to do, because if you bring in outside air and it's humid, as it is around here a lot, you've got to dehumidify it, which takes energy, and you've got to temper it. But what we do to counter the cost of doing that is we capture the thermal energy from the air that we exhaust and give it the thermal energy to the air we bring in. So for instance, let's just make up a temperature. Let's say it's 100 degrees outside today. We're extracting 70-degree air and bringing in 100. We can transfer some of that thermal energy of the 70-degree air and give it to the hotter air and maybe drop it down to 78, 82 degrees, something like that, before it enters the system. So we just capture, it's like I say, so many of these things, the synonym ought to be duh. Because why would you exhaust cool air and bring in hot air and not try to exchange that thermal energy? So, you know, where we got good outcomes was just asking, how can we give more outside air without spending too much money on it? And so these systems exist. We didn't invent them, but they're $50,000 here, $80,000 there. So, and then there's a lot of things to consider. But that's how we accomplished it, is we were really focused on the guest experience. And it turns out, like for instance, we monitor the CO2, which is sort of the inverse of oxygen. And so it tells you feel better with higher levels of oxygen. So in this hotel, we have 4 different monitoring points, and so we watch the CO2 levels on a real-time basis. And if they get too high, which means oxygen is going down, we figure out what's wrong, because you feel better with higher levels of oxygen, lower levels of CO2. You sleep better. All kinds of good things happen.
Wow.
So,
well, you know, what I love too is that so often we believe there are trade-offs, that if you're going to have customer satisfaction and make it just a visually beautiful, but also something that feels good for your body in a hotel, that must mean it's going to be lots more expensive, it's going to use a lot more energy, it's going to take a lot more filters sort of on top of an existing system, instead of really thinking about the common sense of the system itself and looking at the whole kind of ecosystem.
I just think that what happens with these big capital expenditures like building a hotel or an office building, folks just are really adverse to risk, and bankers are really adverse to risk. So we accomplished being able to do what we sort of wanted to do by not having very much debt and not having very much supervision, really. and so we were able to say, well, that makes sense. I'm willing to take that chance. It's my money and my partner's money who's choosing to trust us with it. So let's be careful with this, but let's really consider the possibilities rather than the limitations. And it's really, you know, it's just remarkable to me as a society. I just really want to think about how can we cause more of us to think outside of the herd mentality. I don't know if that's a perfect way to say it, because this wasn't that difficult to create an environment that uses a lot less energy and is more comfortable for guests, and that's proven with their 5 years of operation and in terms of the financial and the guest response and all that. But very few places are doing it. So it's an interesting thing. I think I know the reason is that people don't want to make a mistake. They don't want the bankers don't want to make a mistake. They don't want to have a portion of their investment have a 7-year return when they're counting on a 4-year return for other parts of it. It's just, it's unfortunate, but we are woefully behind our potential.
Yeah. When I talked to you 5 years ago, I asked you what you thought was one of the most important lessons, and you said something like that it wasn't that hard, and that there was a positive and a negative to that. The positive was 60 or 80 people in Greensboro, North Carolina were able to achieve this amazing thing, the nation's first Platinum LEED hotel. That's a positive.
Yeah.
The negative was, you said, if we could do it, why isn't everybody else? That's I've never forgotten that. In fact, I end every lecture with that. You know,
Yeah.
why isn't everybody else? If it isn't that hard, why aren't we doing it? What is? How do we hobble ourselves and keep ourselves from doing it?
I honestly think that a big part of that answer is how we do our bookkeeping. The way we amortize assets, the way we capitalize assets, the way that if we just did something like, just for instance, what if we just said that if you build any building that's being built or remodeled, does an energy model, which will happen in a few years. If your energy model and thus your energy bills come in below a threshold, we'll allow you to amortize the asset faster. But if it's above a threshold, you have to amortize it slower. So you would give a financial incentive. Oh gosh, if I can save 15% on energy rather than having 30-year amortization on the building, 39-year amortization on a building, I can bring it down to 28 years, which is going to mean $160,000 a year in tax savings. Everyone would pay attention to it, but we're not doing some simple little things that would get us financially oriented people. I just think we all ought to think about these different hats. I don't consider myself an environmentalist or a capital. I do consider myself an environmentalist and a capitalist and all these, but I don't necessarily wear the hats at the same time. I can sort of walk around the circle and look at things from different perspective and find one that makes common sense. For us, the reason we are able to look at it a little bit differently, candidly, is that what I mentioned already is that we just put more equity in, so we didn't have supervision.
Right. That's very, very interesting. And the structural issue you talked about, again, it's sort of like testing, you know, value what you count. If we don't have a structure that actually allows you to amortize in a certain way that builds in sustainability, it's not going to happen. But a tiny change in the structure allows people to think in a different way, because suddenly you're measuring a whole different value system. You're saying different things count in different ways. It's kind of true in education as well as in business.
I think it is. I really think it is. There seems to be so much momentum. I talk about it in the hotel industry, and I think it applies to education, that there's just so much momentum. This is the way we've been doing it for years, and there's a lot of value in that. But you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater by saying we have to just turn everything upside down. In fact, I think a lot of it not only is unlearning, like we mentioned before, but for instance, it'd be arrogant to think that daylighting's a new idea. I mean, my gosh, before electricity, that's how we did it.
Yes.
And so, you know, with candles and oil and that, so, you know, figuring out how to optimize sun, like I can look at this event space up there, you can see the shades are drawn, and it's because it's too bright in there, even though the lights are turned off. We have to dim the lights, and the lights are off, because even with the cloudy day, so daylighting is not a new idea. It's a matter of not, in a lot of instances, where we need to go, and maybe this is true in education, I thought about it, is not a case of inventing, it's a case of uninventing.
Oh, it is. It is. I mean, part of the argument of this class is that if you're teaching farmers how to be factory workers, you're basically teaching humans how to be machines. You're regularizing and standardizing things, including creativity.
Right.
That is situational. You know, if you're a farmer and you go out in your field and you're going to fix the fence that day, but it turns out your cow is all tied up in the barbed wire, you don't worry about the barbed wire. You fix your cow. You're going to lose your cow if he bleeds to death. Then you worry about the barbed wire. You're making judgment calls all the time.
Yeah, it's not fair.
On the assembly line, you don't do that. So we have an education system that was designed to get us to be as machine-like as possible. And that means sometimes we think about how to build a brighter light bulb, not how to let in the daylight outside.
Yeah, it's like I think she's a friend of yours too, Dr. Janetta B. Cole, talks about often the tyranny of the specialist, and that we you know, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, that sort of thing.
Yes.
And so there's a tendency to get specialized, but the resourcefulness of our ancestors is something that if you're a specialist, you say, well, you know, someone's bleeding, you say, well, I'm not trained in that. Well, heck, you know, figure out, maybe you can help them. And being more resourceful, like you mentioned, farmers, my goodness, they were mechanics, they were vets, they were, you know, they were meteorologists, and they didn't have other, and particularly with the internet, the opportunities to be resourceful are just fantastic. But we're training it out, and we had a situation at one of our hotels recently with some lights out, and there was a short, so we didn't have any lights. And I said, well, we really don't need the light there, but it looks silly that the lights are off. Let's do something about it. And they said, well, literally, one of my colleagues said, wonderful people, as no put down here, said, I just couldn't imagine a way to handle it, so I didn't do anything. And I said, well, what my thinking is we're untraining imagination, which is resourcefulness.
Right. Yes.
And so we went to the store and bought some battery-operated lights and stuck them in there until we could get the wiring fixed, and it looked nicer for our guests. The point is that any farmer, you know, so how do we do that? That's your job. But it's my job as an entrepreneur and as a leader to set a context culturally where the chefs in the kitchen and the people at the front door and the people in the hotels, if someone asked for something or we see a need or a problem, that we think beyond our specialization to try to solve it. We are resourceful.
Yes, and that exactly is what this class is about, to say that there are all kinds of ways we learn outside of school that are actually in the age of the internet are very resourceful.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, right now, 75% of American doctors say that the first thing they ask their patients now is, what do you think's wrong? Because their patients actually come with better information. They're better informed than they ever have been before. Yeah. And it's useful to the doctor to hear what patients have already found out on the internet by going around trying to find out about their illnesses, doing self-diagnosis. So-and-so said this on one website, so-and-so said another. It's efficient for the doctors to hear from patients.
Yeah.
How we can do that in school is exactly what this class is about.
Well, yeah, and I really feel strongly that if and I endeavor to practice this. I don't think I do a very good job of it, but the idea of recognizing that I am a student constantly, I am a teacher constantly, that you don't sort of check in and check out of these roles. But I think the way we've had it rigged in this country, in my experience, is, okay, student's over, now you're a workaround and you just grind the salt for a while, and then you get old and you die, and that's it. and there's really, it's not true. I mean, that I believe that my learnings are as significant and as that I'm learning as much now as when I was 15.
I think that's true, and I think my friend Sebastian Thrun, who's a very, very, very brilliant computer scientist, he invented the driverless car, he's invented the Google glasses, he invented Google Street Map, and now runs Udacity, which is another MOOC, a different MOOC from a different company, likes to say we have the world divided up, or human life divided up into play, and then school, and then work. And he said, that's wrong. It should be play your whole life.
The whole darn time, yeah.
School, learn your whole life, and work your whole life.
Right.
I mean, all of those things should be integrated, and they all should be components of life. And I agree with that.
I agree with him, and it's difficult. I don't profess that I practice it, and I have all my, so, do as I say, not as I do. But I really think it's so exciting to realize, like, for instance, I have a good friend, he's dead now, but I still think of him in the present tense, who is a behavioral scientist and very accomplished and very respected. And he says one of his most important behavioral lessons came while working on the roof of one of his sheds with this man that helped him do work on his farm. And he was working on something, he was worried about something else, and his name was John. And he said, oh, John, I was talking about worrying about something with the irrigation or something, I don't remember what it was. And John said, Doc, why the hell don't you just do what you're doing?
Ooh.
And I just think that's profound for behavioral scientists, because it's like, the basic idea is be here now, do what you're doing, and and it really is a great idea. And if you're really here now, then spontaneity and joy and resourcefulness and all these things that we're talking about are available. But we sort of live somewhat in the future as a society, it seems, and we're so concerned about making a mistake or looking silly that we, what I often say is we modify our behavior to ensure that someone doesn't make fun of us when they probably wouldn't make fun of us anyway. There's a huge sort of peer pressure thing, even at 56 years old, that I find that I'm worried, well, what would so-and-so think about that? But I think it's very limiting. I think that being playful, Just like you're saying, I think it's a huge part of when you go to a restaurant and you feel like you're being taken good care of. Most of the time, it's because the people are enjoying being there, and that doesn't mean they're in the back shooting down shooters being playful. It means that they're being lighthearted, helpful, and constructive with each other, but not acting like this is something that is going to be the end of the world if we happen to make a little mistake.
Yeah, I think
pretend like it's real.
Pretend like, yeah, right, exactly. I think sometimes we do things too much worrying about the future, but also sometimes bound too much in the past, and it's the present that we don't understand how to learn from.
Well, with our team, I often say, anticipate, appreciate, but mostly celebrate.
That's good. I like that. I think that's kind of the ending note, but
right.
We've talked to lots of people in the course of this class, and we always end with one question. So I want to hear what you say to our question that we ask everybody. Who was your favorite teacher and why?
Oh, gosh.
And you can have more than one.
Well, I didn't go to college, so that doesn't come out of school, but this great friend of mine, Bill Carlisle, that helped us design restaurants. And what he taught me is just, it's just manifold. It's just all kinds of things, but we became very good friends. And his sort of quiet wisdom and how he derived joy from his life. His wife had Alzheimer's, and he took care of her at home. And when she was sick, so many people it lasted for 15 years or more, would say, "Oh, you've got such a burden." And we were close enough, he would say, "I don't want to correct my friends, but they don't get that being of service to her is being of service to me. Being able to express my compassion and express my service, this is part of who it works for me. I'm as in love as I've ever been, even though she isn't there present with me. At some other level we are." So that he took something that you might read in some book and say, "Yeah, that makes sense," but he was living it.
Wow.
For a decade. And not just that, but several other lessons from my buddy Bill. And I don't think a day goes by where I don't hear his voice somehow.
Wow.
And I don't have sort of pretend conversations. Wow. There's a few others like that.
Well, that's a beautiful way to end the course. Students get to see teacher with tears in eyes over such a beautiful way to end the course. It's really been an honor to spend this time with you. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for being part of the history and future of mostly higher education. Thank you.
I'm delighted. It's fun.
Thank you.